If you want to understand what happened to me that day, you can't blink for a minute. That day, I nearly died. It was one of those nights when the absolute silence makes you question if the world around you really exists. I was sitting by the lake, alone for a moment, watching the dark and calm water. What should have been a peaceful and relaxing scene started to turn unsettling. The feeling of being watched was palpable, almost tangible, as if 1,000 invisible eyes were spying on me from the depths. The weekend had everything to be perfect. My friends, Lucas, Pedro, and Rafael, and I decided to escape from our routine and spent months planning this fishing trip. The lake was famous for the huge fish it held, and the promise of an epic catch filled us with excitement. Arrival was filled with laughter and jokes as we set up our camp by the lake. Lucas, always the most competitive, was already preparing his fishing rods while Pedro and Rafael debated who would catch the biggest fish. The atmosphere was charged with excitement, but at some point, that strange feeling started growing inside me. I didn't share it with the others, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks. Night fell quickly, and we decided to start our first round of fishing. Lucas was the first to feel a strong tug on his line. His eyes lit up with excitement as he battled what seemed to be a gigantic fish. We all gathered around him, cheering and cheering. When the fish finally emerged from the water, we were astonished. The fish glowed in the dark, emitting a faint and mysterious light. We had never seen anything like it. Pedro, ever the skeptic, suggested it might be some sort of glowing algae or bioluminescence, but Lucas was convinced we had found the perfect bait. He was determined to use it to lure something even bigger. We decided to continue fishing despite the growing discomfort I felt. The first night stretched on, and with it, my sense of unease. The water seemed to whisper ancient secrets, and shadows danced along the edge of our camp, creating strange figures that vanished when we looked directly at them. Trying to push those thoughts away, I focused on my friends' animated conversation. But even amidst the laughter and stories, I couldn't shake the oppressive feeling. As the night wore on, the lake seemed to come alive, as if something was awakening in the depths, waiting patiently. When we finally decided to turn in for the night, I knew something was wrong. I lay down in the tent, but sleep wouldn't come. I heard the sounds of the lake, and every little noise made my heart race. I closed my eyes, trying to ignore the anxiety, but the whispers of the lake continued to haunt me. Little did I know that would be the last peaceful night we would spend together. The glowing fish we had caught was not just a curious find, it was an omen, a sign that something much more sinister was about to happen. And as the night progressed, what was hidden in the depths began to reveal itself. When the sun started to rise on the horizon, I woke up with a jolt. The morning light seemed to bring a false sense of security, but something was wrong. As I stepped out of my tent, I noticed that Lucas was nowhere to be found. His belongings were scattered around the cold campfire, but he himself had vanished. At first, we thought he had gone fishing early, but as the hours passed, the worry grew. Lucas wasn't the type to disappear without a word. Pedro, always practical, suggested we should search for him, so we spread out around the lake, calling his name. It was Pedro who found the first signs. Near the lake's edge, there were deep scratch marks on the ground, as if something or someone had been dragged. Panic began to set in, but Raphael tried to stay calm, saying that Lucas probably slipped and was trying to find his way back. We spent the whole day searching, but there was no sign of Lucas. As night approached, a sense of despair began to envelop us. We decided to continue our search through the night, armed with flashlights and knives, but fear was etched on everyone's faces. As we walked through the darkness, the whispers in the water returned, more intense this time. It was as if the lake was alive, whispering terrible secrets that only I could hear. Every shadow seemed to come to life, and every snap of a twig or sound of water made me jump. Suddenly, a scream cut through the night. We ran towards the sound and found Pedro alone, trembling and in shock. He couldn't speak properly, but his eyes told everything. Something had taken Raphael. The scratch marks on the ground, similar to the ones we found before, confirmed our worst fear. Pedro was in panic, but we managed to drag him back to the camp. We sat by the fire, trying to understand what was happening. My heart was racing, and the feeling of being watched was almost unbearable. I wondered if I would be the next victim of that sinister presence. We decided it was better to stick together, but the fear and tension were palpable. None of us could sleep, so we took turns keeping watch. In the middle of the night, I heard footsteps approaching our tent. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible, but enough to keep me on edge. I got up slowly and saw a figure standing by the lake. My heart stopped for a moment when I realized it was Raphael. I ran to him, but as I got closer, I noticed something was wrong. His eyes were glassy, and he mumbled incomprehensible words as if he were in a trance. When I tried to touch him, he collapsed to the ground, lifeless. Pedro and I carried him back to the fire, trying to wake him up, but Raphael didn't respond. He seemed trapped in some terrible nightmare. It was then that I saw something in the water. A huge shadow moved slowly, as if watching us. The whispers intensified, and the figure in the water seemed to feed off our fear. Pedro was on the verge of a breakdown. He started talking about the bait, the glowing fish, convinced that it all started with that. I agreed, but by then, we didn't know what to do. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. I felt that the lake was trapping us, and every attempt to escape was futile. Dawn brought a brief moment of relief, but the sight of Raphael, still unconscious, reminded us of the terror of the previous night. Pedro was determined to leave everything behind and run, but I knew we couldn't abandon our friends. We needed to find out what was happening, and somehow put an end to it. The terrifying truth began to unfold in my mind. The bait was not an ordinary fish but a lure, a trap. Something in the depths of the lake was hungry, and we were the next feast. As the whispers continued to torment my thoughts, I knew the final confrontation was approaching. And deep down, I feared that none of us would survive to tell this story. The first light of dawn brought a brief moment of relief, but also the brutal reality that we were trapped in a never-ending nightmare. Raphael remained inert, murmuring incomprehensible things, while Pedro could barely stay calm. The feeling of being watched never left us, as if the darkness itself was watching us. We decided we needed to act. Abandoning our friends was not an option. Pedro and I carried Raphael to the center of the camp, where we set up an improvised barricade with what little we had. The lake was silent, but a silence that carried a promise of terror. The plan was simple: use the glowing bait to attract whatever was in the lake and confront it. We were desperate, with no other choice. Pedro prepared the line while I held Raphael, trying to keep him conscious. The fish glowed intensely, as if it knew its purpose was about to be fulfilled. We cast the line into the water and waited. Time seemed to crawl, each second a step closer to the abyss. Suddenly, the line began to move, slowly at first, then with overwhelming force. Pedro held on tight, and I could see the fear in his eyes. The water began to bubble, and the lake's surface violently churned. A gigantic form emerged from the depths, something not of this world. Its eyes, large and bright, reflected an ancient hunger, pure evil. The creature was a grotesque mix of fish and something more, something that shouldn't exist. Pedro tried to pull back, but the creature advanced quickly, its enormous jaws opening in a silent roar. In an instant, Pedro was pulled into the water, his hands flailing desperately before disappearing beneath the surface. I screamed, but the sound seemed to be swallowed by the lake itself. Alone with Raphael, who remained in his catatonic state, I felt the creature's presence closing in. The lake seemed alive, and I knew I didn't have much time. Desperate, I grabbed one of the knives and prepared for what was to come. The water around us began to move, and I could feel the creature approaching. Suddenly, a cold hand grabbed my ankle. I looked down and saw Lucas's face, pale and lifeless, his empty eyes fixed on mine. I tried to free myself, but he held me with supernatural strength. The creature emerged again, and this time, I could clearly see its intent. It was a predator, and we were its prey. Its eyes stared at me, filled with insatiable hunger. As I struggled to break free, I realized I was being dragged into the water, into the depths where my friends already were. Terror consumed me, and my mind began to unravel. The last thing I saw before being pulled into the darkness was Raphael, now standing, his eyes still glassy, but filled with the same terror I felt. The lake was no longer just water. It was a living, breathing entity that consumed everything in its path. To this day, the lake remains a place of dark legends and unsolved mysteries. My friend's disappearance was never explained, and I am left with the haunting memories of that night. Sometimes, in the silence of the night, I hear the whispers again, as if the lake is calling me back. And each time, I wonder if I'm the next to disappear into the depths of that cursed place. I woke up before dawn, as usual, and walked to the lake with my fishing gear. The mist covering the water was dense and oppressive, a thick, white blanket that turned the familiar landscape into something alien and threatening. As I put my boat in the water and started rowing, the mist seemed to close in around me, muffling all sounds except my own rapid, irregular breaths. I felt a strange chill, penetrating my bones despite the summer heat. As I rowed, the mist danced and twisted as if it had a life of its own, forming fleeting shapes that vanished as soon as I tried to focus on them. Something deep in my mind screamed at me to turn back, to abandon fishing that morning and return to the safety of solid ground, but I ignored it. I thought I was being foolish, that the mist and solitude were playing tricks on me. That's when the whispers began. At first, they were just distant murmurs, indistinguishable from the sound of the wind. But as I ventured further into the center of the lake, the whispers grew clearer, more distinct. They were human voices, laden with pain and desperation. "Help us! We can't get out! He's here!" I stopped rowing for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to find a rational explanation for what I was hearing. "It must be the wind," I murmured to myself, though I knew I was lying. There was something in that mist, something ancient and malevolent, and it was watching me. I could feel its invisible eyes fixed on me, waiting for me to make a mistake. Despite that, I continued. Rowing was the only thing that kept me calm, that gave me a sense of normalcy. I reached my favorite spot on the lake, a small cove surrounded by tall, dense trees where the fish were always plentiful. I anchored the boat and prepared my fishing line, trying to ignore the whispers that now seemed to be right beside me. "You're just imagining things," I repeated to myself as I cast the line into the water. "None of this is real." But as the sun began to rise, and the first rays of light cut through the mist, I saw something that froze my blood. Nebulous figures started to form in the mist around the boat. Silhouettes of people, their faces twisted in expressions of agony. They weren't just in my mind, they were there, floating in the mist, staring at me with empty eyes. A shiver ran down my spine, and a sense of panic began to take over. But before I could do anything, my fishing line suddenly became heavy. Too heavy. It was as if I had hooked something immense and immovable. My initial instinct was excitement. Perhaps it was the biggest fish I had ever caught. But as I pulled on the line, excitement quickly turned into pure, absolute terror. What emerged from the dark waters of the lake was not a fish. It was a hand, pale and swollen, gripping my line with a strength that seemed impossible for something dead. I pulled with all my might, trying to rid myself of that horrifying sight, but the hand kept coming up, revealing an arm, and then a face staring at me with lifeless eyes, the mouth open in a silent scream of pain. I let out a scream and dropped the line, falling backward in the boat. The figures in the mist moved closer, the whispers now screams of fear and desperation. "He's here, you can't escape." Desperate, I tried to row back to shore, but the mist seemed alive, pushing against me, driving me back toward the center of the lake. Every stroke seemed futile, and the feeling of being trapped grew inside me, a suffocating panic that made it hard to breathe. It was in that moment, surrounded by ghostly figures and with my heart racing uncontrollably, that I realized the terrible truth. The mist was not just a natural anomaly. It was the manifestation of something ancient and evil, a malevolence that claimed the souls of those who dared to challenge its waters. And now, it wanted me as its next victim. The mist around the boat was denser than I had ever seen. It was as if an opaque veil had descended, blocking out the sunlight and and turning the lake into a strange and threatening place. I felt as though I was in the middle of a nightmare, but the persistent whispers reminded me there was no waking up. Every sound, every shadow, seemed laden with malicious intent. I had cast my fishing line, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but the mist closed in around me, forming indistinct shapes that seemed to watch me. My fingers were trembling, and my heart beat so fast I could barely breathe. The silence was almost absolute, broken only by the moans echoing through the mist, as if it were weeping itself. Suddenly, I felt a strong tug on the line. My first thought was relief. Perhaps it was a big fish, something that might distract me from the oppressive feeling of being watched. But as I pulled on the line, the resistance increased alarmingly. It was as if something immense and immovable was on the other end. I kept pulling, the line straining almost to the breaking point, and that's when I saw it. Emerging from the water slowly was a pale, swollen arm, followed by a distorted face and a silent scream of agony. The sight was so shocking I almost let go of the line. A corpse, hanging from the end of my hook, its lifeless eyes fixed on me, the mouth open in an eternal scream. I let out a scream of pure terror and dropped the line, falling backward in the boat. The corpse slid back into the water with a nauseating sound, but the image was burned into my mind. Shaking and sweating, I tried to catch my breath, but the whispers around me grew louder. They were closer now, more insistent. "Help us! He's here! You can't escape!" Despair overwhelmed me. What was that? Who were those voices? And more importantly, how could I escape this infernal trap? Rowing seemed useless, as the mist surrounded me, forming an impenetrable barrier. My arms ached from the effort, but the shore seemed further away. I tried to calm myself, to think rationally, but each attempt was crushed by the screams and laments filling the air. I felt like an animal cornered, each moment bringing me closer to a deadly trap. Fear turned every second into an eternity, and the feeling of being watched grew unbearable. I decided to try one more time. I gripped the oars tightly and began to row with all my strength. My arms burned, sweat dripped down my face, but I continued, driven by pure survival instinct. The mist seemed to resist, pushing against me, but I couldn't stop. I needed to get out of there. Then, amidst my frenzy, the mist parted for a moment, revealing a horrific sight. The nebulous figures I had seen before were closer now, and I could see their faces clearly. They were people, men, women, even children, each with expressions of suffering and despair. Their hands reached out to me, as if trying to grab me, and their empty eyes begged me for help. The sight paralyzed me. Those were the souls of the people who had disappeared there, trapped by the cursed mist. Each one was a warning, a testament to the ancient evil that inhabited that lake. And now, it wanted to add me to its collection of lost souls. Feeling panic take hold of me, I abruptly turned the boat around and started rowing in the opposite direction. I needed to get out, no matter what. But the mist, alive and aware, closed in around me, forming an impenetrable barrier. Every movement seemed to push me further from the shore, and the sense of hopelessness grew inside me. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A deep, guttural sound coming from the depths of the mist. It was like a distant roar, a sound that spoke of insatiable hunger and ancient malevolence. The mist was not just a veil of lost souls, it was the manifestation of a primordial evil that wanted to devour me. Struggling against the panic, I tried to find a way out. My eyes scanned the mist for a point of reference, anything that could guide me to safety. But all I saw were those nebulous figures, their faces twisted in agony, their empty eyes watching me. Feeling my strength waning, I realized I was trapped. There was no escape from that mist, from that ancient evil. And as my vision began to darken and the whispers became deafening, I knew my fate was sealed. The mist had claimed me, and now I was just another lost soul in its domain. The mist seemed to swallow the world around me, a tangible and oppressive presence that crushed any remnants of hope. My arms ached from rowing, but the lake felt endless, an ocean of dark, murky water. The feeling of being hunted grew stronger inside me, turning my fear into pure terror. The whispers around me had turned into screams. wails of tormented souls tearing through the silence with a nearly palpable desperation. The nebulous figures that were once indistinct shadows now moved clearly around the boat, their faces twisted in eternal pain. They reached out to me, their voices joined in a hellish chorus. "You can't escape, he's coming, prepare to die." Then I saw something rise from the depths of the lake. A colossal shadow, a figure shrouded in darkness that seemed to absorb the light around it. My heart nearly stopped when I realized what it was. An ancient, monstrous entity, its form writhing and shifting as if it were made of the very mist surrounding me. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent hunger, and its mouth stretched into a horrifying grin. I tried to row faster, but the oars felt like they were moving through molasses. The entity loomed closer, its presence overwhelming. The mist around me grew colder, more suffocating, and the whispers turned into shrill, discordant shrieks. It was as if the very essence of the lake had come alive to consume me. In a final burst of desperate energy, I rowed with everything I had. The mist seemed to close in tighter, the shadow growing larger. But then, through the veil of fear and despair, I saw a faint light, a glimmer of hope on the horizon. I fought through the terror, pushing myself beyond my limits, and rowed toward the light. The entity roared, a sound that shook the very core of my being, and the mist swirled violently. But as I neared the light, the darkness seemed to recede, the whispers fading into an eerie silence. With one last effort, I reached the shore, collapsing onto the solid ground. As I looked back, the mist had dissipated, and the lake appeared calm and normal. The figures and the entity were gone, leaving only the tranquil water and the early morning light. I knew, though, that the horrors I had witnessed were not just figments of my imagination. The lake had tried to claim me, and I had narrowly escaped its grasp. To this day, I avoid that lake and its mist. The memory of those terrifying whispers and the monstrous entity haunt me, a reminder of the ancient evil that lurks beneath the surface, waiting for its next victim. I can't believe I'm telling you this. Pay close attention. The night was almost complete, a shroud of darkness and mystery enveloping the isolated river. The environment was silent, except for the occasional sound of water gently murmuring against the vegetation-covered banks. The dense fog drifting over the water's surface seemed to absorb all sounds, creating a sense of isolation that only deepened the discomfort. I had been there for hours, immersed in a solitude that only fishermen understand. The stars barely shone through the cloudy sky, and the penetrating cold seemed to seep into my bones with each passing minute. I had given up any hope of a good catch that night when I finally felt the weight on the line. The pull was strong, almost unexpected, and a shiver ran down my spine. I adjusted myself, straining to pull in the line. The fish seemed substantial, fighting with a strength that reminded me of those old stories about mythical creatures lurking in dark, deep waters. When the fish finally emerged from the shadows, my breath caught. It was enormous, with scales reflecting a strange silvery light. But what caught my attention the most was the hook firmly lodged in the fish's mouth. It wasn't an ordinary hook, it was made of silver, with intricate details that seemed to be carved with almost obsessive precision. The cold gleam of the metal seemed to radiate a sinister aura. As I lifted the fish from the water, the hook stood out even more. There was something disturbingly beautiful about the object, as if it carried an ancient and menacing energy. I couldn't help but feel intrigued and, at the same time, unsettled. The hook seemed out of place, as if it didn't belong to this world. The fish, once out of the water, thrashed and wriggled before finally lying still, as if it too was sensing the strange object in its mouth. That night, carrying the hook home, an inexplicable chill and discomfort accompanied me. The silver metal seemed to weigh more than its size suggested. I tried to ignore the growing sense of unease, convincing myself it was just the accumulated frustration of a fruitless night of fishing. When I got home, I placed the hook on the kitchen table and examined it more closely. Every detail of the silverwork seemed to tell an ancient story, but exactly what that story was, I didn't know. I just felt drawn to it, as if I were being pulled by an invisible and irresistible force. Looking at the hook, a feeling of discomfort began to grow inside me. It was as if the object carried a symbolic weight, something beyond normal understanding. The night went on, and I lay in bed, the sensation of an invisible gaze never leaving me. I closed my eyes, trying to push away the disturbing thought, but something within me knew that this night would not end like the others. That's when I heard the first sound. A faint noise, almost like a whisper, coming from the direction of the kitchen. My heart raced. I knew I was alone at home, so what could be making that sound? I got up slowly, the darkness around me seeming to become denser, more oppressive. When I reached the kitchen and looked at the hook, it seemed to glow unsettlingly, as if it were waiting for something. Something I wasn't ready to face. The first night after bringing the hook home was marked by a series of vivid and disturbing nightmares I couldn't explain. As I prepared to sleep, the discomfort that had haunted me in the kitchen wouldn't leave me alone. I struggled to convince myself it was just nerves or fatigue. After all, I was an experienced fisherman, and strange objects sometimes appeared in the waters without further consequences. However, as I plunged into sleep, my mind found no rest. Instead, I was immediately pulled into a dark and twisted world where time and space seemed to contort in grotesque ways. The first nightmare started almost normally, with a familiar landscape, the riverbank where I had fished. But soon, I realized something was wrong. The water was black, not with the dark hue of a deep river, but with an opaque viscosity, as if it were filled with mud and unspoken secrets. The sky was covered with thick clouds that seemed to breathe, pulsing with an unsettling energy. Then the hooded figure appeared. At first, it was just an indistinct shadow, but it soon materialized into disturbing details. The hood concealed its face, but I felt its eyes fixed on me, penetrating and relentless. Its presence was like a weight settling on my shoulders, an overwhelming pressure that seemed to suffocate any rational thought. The figure spoke with a voice that seemed to come from the depths of a tomb, a murmur filled with silent malice. "Return the hook," it said repeatedly. Each word was laden with a sinister authority, a command that seemed to resonate not only in my ears but in every cell of my body. The figure moved closer slowly, and I felt paralyzed, unable to move or look away. The fear I felt was almost physical, a sensation of agony that made me sweat cold and breathe heavily. I would wake up in the middle of the night, my body drenched in sweat and my heart racing, desperately trying to shake off the feeling of terror. Each time I closed my eyes, the image of the hooded figure and its threatening whisper haunted my mind. I felt trapped in a mental prison, where fear wouldn't let me escape, and terror seemed to have become an extension of my own consciousness. During the day, I tried to ignore these nightmares, believing they were just manifestations of stress. Yet the fear didn't leave me. I looked at the hook, now stored in the kitchen drawer, and felt a growing sense of repulsion. I couldn't understand why something so simple, a mere fishing hook, could provoke such terrifying visions. But the hooded figure seemed to be a real presence, a force I couldn't simply ignore. Still, hoping it was just a product of my tired mind, I decided to ignore these signs and continue with my routine. The idea that the hook might have some deeper or more threatening meaning was something I refused to accept. However, the feeling that something was about to happen continued to grow, like a storm gathering on the horizon, ready to break. By the second night, I was already desperate. The discomfort I felt with the hook was unbearable, but my stubbornness and belief that nothing bad could really happen pushed me out of the house and back to the river. The memories of the nightmares were still vivid, but I tried to convince myself they were just manifestations of my disturbed mind. The river was even darker that night. The fog seemed thicker, covering the water's surface with a layer of mystery. I set up my gear, trying to stay focused on fishing and ignore the growing feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. I began fishing, but the unease wouldn't leave me. The silver hook lay at the bottom of the water, like a reflection of my own unease. After some time, I felt a tug on the line. A shiver ran down my spine, but I took a deep breath and continued. When I finally pulled the fish out of the water, the hook was there, glowing disturbingly at the bottom of the container. That's when I noticed something horrifying. The hook was stuck in the fish again. I had removed it and carefully stored it at home. But now it was back, as if it had a will of its own. Desperate, I took it out and threw it on the shore, trying to get rid of it. That's when I heard the first sound, a faint whisper, almost imperceptible, coming from the direction of the water. My heart raced. I looked around, but saw no one. The feeling of being watched intensified. I grabbed the hook and put it back in my bag, deciding it would be best to leave. However, the terror began to manifest in a concrete way. As I started packing up my gear, the hooded figure appeared, as if emerging from the shadows. The hood concealed its face, but I could feel its presence as an oppressive weight on my chest. The figure approached slowly, its steps heavy and relentless. Panic set in. I tried to run, but the feeling that something was following me was inescapable. Every time I looked over my shoulder, the figure was closer. I ran along the riverbank, desperately trying to escape, but no matter how fast I ran, the hooded figure seemed always a few steps behind. At first, I thought I could rid myself of the figure by getting away from the river, so I tried to leave the area. However, as soon as I turned to leave, I saw the hook was back in my gear, as if it were materializing from the air. It was as if it was hooked to my very soul, unable to be separated from me. The hooded figure started to become more tangible, more real. I could hear its heavy breathing, see the hood moving with a sound that was almost a whisper. I ran through the forest around the river, my legs feeling as though they were made of lead. The fear became paralyzing, an overwhelming sensation that prevented me from thinking clearly. Then, the figure finally reached my side. I was so exhausted I could barely move. The hooded figure extended a hand and took the hook, its cold and stiff hands seeming made of ice. Its eyes, now visible under the hood, were black holes of endless darkness. With a swift movement, the figure pulled the hook back and put it back in my bag. I tried to protest, but the words came out as a weak moan. The presence of the hooded figure seemed to absorb all the light around me. I was engulfed in a deep shadow, a place where time and space lost their meaning. The figure's whisper was the only sound I could hear, its voice penetrating my consciousness with an ominous clarity. "Return it," it repeated, each word resonating like an unbearable weight on my chest. "Return it, or you will never escape." I fell to the ground, unable to move. The figure slowly walked away, leaving me behind in a state of utter despair. The fog thickened, and the darkness around me became almost palpable. I couldn't understand why I had been chosen, or why this hook had such a horrifying power over me. From that night on, I couldn't sleep without nightmares. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back by the river, the hooded figure waiting in the shadows, the hook gleaming with its eerie silver light. The terror became an inseparable part of my life, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, it always found a way to invade my thoughts. To this day, I can't get rid of the feeling that something is always watching me. The hook remains in my fishing gear, a constant reminder of that nightmarish encounter. Whenever I look at it, I remember the hooded figure's whisper and the sensation of being trapped in a nightmare that never ends. I don't know what the hook's true purpose is, but it is a powerful force that should never be trifled with. I've come to understand that some things are better left undiscovered, buried in the depths of darkness where they belong.